Hey, what's up, everybody? Thank you all so much for tuning in to our final episode or it's not really an episode, it's more of like our final conversation of Keeping It 110. I am so excited that although this COVID pandemic has kept us from being physically together, we have been able to join one another in our living rooms, in our bedrooms, in the kitchen, maybe even in the car on your phone. But we've been able to stay together and have some really challenging conversations about how we support and educate black and brown boys in the public education system. It's really been a great time for me. I mean, not COVID, the great time, but a great time to be home and to really like think about what do we want to do different when we start going back to school? How do we want to challenge ourselves? How do we want to challenge each other? And it just so happens that in the midst of this COVID pandemic, we as a country have been forced once again to discuss race. Prior to me talking to you right now, I was talking with Robert and Tanisha, and it's very interesting the dynamics of teachers and students. And we're going to get a little bit into that throughout the conversation today. But I want, and how have begun to frame the being a teacher and being an educator is it is social justice work. You are literally, as an educator, lighting the way, moving barriers, eliminating systemic oppression, racism for your students to thrive, right? Whether that is in your school building, in your classroom, and hopefully the people that you create in your classroom are able to take that baton and go out into the world and change it. It's a ripple effect. And that's how I see education. And I'm excited to kind of continue to have this conversation with Tanisha and Robert in a moment. But I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I see we have people from Orange, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Cincinnati, Atlanta, New York, people from all around. So thank you all so much for joining. Really quickly, for those who are new to our platform, Project OneTen is an organization that I began a year and a half ago. And we are centered around building, developing, supporting black and brown young men, black boys, as they transition from middle to high school. Educators know that that is a huge transition. And oftentimes it gets overlooked, and all the attention goes towards the transition from high school to college. So Project OneTen is geared towards building a very similar transition period. Programming, mentors, support, online resources to truly ensure that students complete their freshman year of high school on track and in high academic standing. This past weekend, we completed our first year of programming and we went around and drove to all the guys' homes that we support. And it was just really amazing to see and to hear their success stories, to hear from their parents around the impact that their mentors had on their success. Because when you start an organization, it's just an idea. And you're just like, I hope this can support somebody somewhere. And when you hear from parents the amount of like support and impact that it's had in their lives, it's just so reassuring. So we're looking forward to going to year two, starting in August. And we hope that we can continue to have your support and that you will continue to spread the word about Project OneTen. We are going to learn about some other organizations today in our conversation. Usually at this time, I would let you know who are the other people that we're going to be bringing on. But this is it. This is the final session. So really quickly, I want to introduce, apologies, our two panelists today. We have Tamesha Webb, who is a friend of mine. We attended Clark Atlanta University together, Atlanta, Georgia. I remember very early on Tamesha talking about this all-girl school that she wanted to open. And at that time, I was a film major. I kind of was like into education, but not really. But after I graduated from Clark Atlanta University, our paths kind of like conjoined again, like in this space of education. So really excited to catch up with her and hear about all the things that she's doing in Boston. And then the second individual that we're talking with is Robert Hendricks. I've learned about Robert's work through the My Brother's Keeper action team that I'm a part of here in Chicago, and the work that he's doing to support not only black educators but also black boys in school. So we're going to learn a little bit more about the work that he does as well. So without further ado, I am going to bring on Tamesha and Robert, and we are going to jump in this conversation. So what's up, y'all? How are y'all doing today?
Good, good. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. How are you, Tamesha?
I am doing really well, as good as can be during this time, but I'm good.
That's good. That's what's up. Thank you. So this is my first time doing like the CNN three panel situation. So this looks really, really cool. So hopefully you all out there watching are appreciating this and enjoying this as much as I am. Really quickly, I just moved into a new apartment, so hopefully we don't have any glitches or any sound issues. We just gonna, rebuke that right now. All right, so we getting started. So, Robert, if you could, just give us a quick introduction. Who are you? What do you do? And where are you located? And how have things been going for you and your organization during this COVID quarantine?
Yeah, thank you for having me and thank you for putting these on as often as you do. We definitely need this platform. But I am Robert, as Derek said, I'm in Boston. I've been here for 6 years. I came here as an educator and I spent the first 5.5 years working in the school at various levels doing special education, admin, and a little bit of teaching. And then I started He Is Me Institute, and I know we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. But as Derek said, we are focused on getting more black men to education. So as I said, I am an educator by trade, by training, by practice, and obviously I was a black boy going through school. So those things added up really led me to be able to do this work along with different experiences and conversations I had with people along the way.
That's what's up. Thank you so much, Rob. So, Tamisha, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tamesha Webb. Currently working in Boston as a school leader at a charter school in the Dorchester area. Fairly new to Boston. I just got exposed to it, Boston, I would say about 2 years ago. I had relocated there for grad school and really became interested in the community and decided to return and continue doing my education work there. My background is in girls' education, as Derek mentioned. Um, the goal is to eventually open an all girls school. So I've spent researching and learning about how Black girls learn in school and what our experiences have been like in U.S. schools. Um, right now, my attention and focus is really on leading adults in education. I think it's important for me to really understand that dynamic before I try to dive into leading and like opening an entire school. So a lot of work around like adult culture and leading teams and um, really trying to figure out like how do we get people to stay. That is such a major part of the problem is the retention. So how do we get people to stay in the schools and in this work?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. Just the other day, we had a leadership team meeting at my school, and we were discussing and preparing potentially for individuals leaving. Right? If we in Chicago, we're potentially thinking that school will kind of begin virtual, and just beginning to really think through educators. That's not how they envision being a teacher, right? So we began to really figure out ways that we can still build that culture, make teachers feel like they are still like teaching and having an impact, But we began to think through, like, there may be some teachers who kind of just leave because this virtual lifestyle is like not working at all. So curious, like, in both of you all's lines of work, how have you seen some of the positives, the pluses of like virtual learning, but also like some of the deltas or the areas of like improvement or things that aren't going so well? What are some things that you guys have seen?
Well, I can definitely jump in by saying I think time has actually been on our side. I've actually been doing some end of the year meetings with our teachers, and everyone is talking about how they've had the time to collaborate with other teachers, pop in other classrooms, time that is often hard to find during the school year. So I think that kind of like worked in our favor. And this time away also made us realize that there were so many things that we could have been doing virtually this entire time
Right.
that we absolutely were not. And so I think that those were some of the positives among like the students who may not have been performing the best during the school year, now doing really well while we're learning virtually, trying to figure out like what played into that dynamic that made their learning experience different.
Yeah.
Was the social aspect of school actually like a hindrance for them in their learning? So definitely a lot of positives. I think overall, like schools are not designed to be distant.
Yeah.
So that social aspect of it is definitely missing. And, as much as people think kids don't like school, they are missing the structure of it. And we've definitely like learned that during this time.
Yeah, definitely. I think too, it's been very, at least for me, what I've been so excited about has been the shifting of the narrative that like learning can happen anywhere, right? Like learning doesn't just happen in a building. We should be tooling parents, communities, families to be able to have the resources that they need to provide for their students, whether that's learning, teaching. If a student is absent for a medical situation, why in God's earth are we giving them piles of work when they return? Like, why have we not thought, like, there's this thing called Zoom. Like, there is these Google Classroom, right? Like what you were saying, Tamesha, it's just like, why were we not thinking about these things? Like, but
Right.
curious about you, Rob. Like, what have you seen in your line of work?
Yeah, first of all, everything that Tamesha said, but to add on to it, the positive thing, one of the biggest positive things I've seen is students being more comfortable and literate when it comes to using online platforms and communicating remotely. Just coming from, I worked at a high school, and even at that level, students struggle sometimes with how to draft an email or just to check email regularly.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And then they go on and leave our schools and are not really prepared for colleges are, no matter how they frame the class, it's like a hybrid class because there's always stuff to do online.
Right.
Jobs are like that. And then who knows what's happening with COVID. So them learning and being comfortable and having it in a routine to use computers and communicate that way, I think is one of the biggest benefits that we're getting from this.
Yeah.
On the flip side, the unequitable access to these resources is still a hindrance, although some schools and districts are passing out laptops and making sure people have like hotspots, but they still have families with one or two computers or in an environment where being on class online is either not comfortable or just not conducive.
Yeah.
So, and it's harder to hold folks accountable when you don't see them in person. You're really counting on them to do something on the other end, and who knows what factors play into that. And also with this use of technology, not enough people are skilled with it yet. We haven't really shown families how to use it. We haven't really shown teachers or students how to use some of the resources. So we could do a better job at leveraging the things that we do have. And as Tamesha said, and as you said too, we see that we could do so much more with remote learning. So now we are at the stage where people actually have to know how to use the stuff.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was just having a conversation with a teacher this past week about, I think we have kind of assumed that the students that we're working with, they grow up with computers, iPhones in their hands, that they just automatically know how to use computers. I remember sitting in a computer class, learning how to type, like learning how to do Excel. I tell this story all the time. Like I credit my elementary school computer teacher for like me being able to type because we had the little covers over the keyboard and we could not peek. But like those things don't happen in school anymore because it's like just the assumption that these students know how to use it. And I think this was the true test. Like, no, we still have to, we can't assume that. We still have to teach students how to use computers, go over the basics, because if it's not at home, if it's not readily available to them, then it's not something that they like just easily know how to do. So that was, I mean, a really great point.
And I think like when we talk about access, right, it usually airs to socioeconomics,
Yeah,
right? Like, do they have access to technology? Do they have access to internet? But we sometimes forget about other privileges when we talk about access, like just learning disabilities and learning challenges, right? So like we have tons of students that have IEPs or 504s and need supports in those ways that were not able to receive that during this distant learning time. So now we're like ultimately like forcing these kids to learn through a computer all day long when there are other services that they may need. So I think like that was another way that like, it just wasn't equitable.
yeah, totally. I think one of the like good things that came out of this though was around standardized testing. Um,
Mhm.
I am not a great I'm not a great test taker at all. So when I began to hear that, like, I've been to school already. I have a graduate degree, but I've been like really wanting to go back and get an MBA. And I've been hearing that like certain grad schools were starting to like waive the test because you can't come in. I was like, oh, let me get my application
Apply now,
together right
right?
now. I'm about to submit this thing. But even like AP tests for students in high school, right? Like they had to really think through how do we test students. And I think honestly, it really benefited students who do have those differences, right? They don't test well in like an environment. Like let me test at home. Like let me listen to music. Like let me figure out like how I best um, can do well like in this situation. So I think it definitely has its pluses, and opportunities like to grow. But I think it's definitely something that we need to continue to look at as we reimagine what schools look like. Yeah. So I guess like my next kind of question, Tamisha, because I know you like are at on leading a school right now, and one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of weeks in the midst of being home, COVID, really grieving social interaction. There was, a lot of we had a lot of issues, racial tensions and police murders and things that went on that really mobilized many people across our country. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was educators really not knowing their place. Like, what can I do? Like, what am I supposed to do beyond teaching, or especially white teachers, right? I think black teachers, like, those are our people. Like, we're gonna make it happen, right? But I think for you, leading a school with primarily white staff members, what was kind of your approach? Like, what do you do, like, moving forward? Especially, you all serve, I'm assuming, mostly black and brown kids, right? So what was your approach? Like, how did you all talk to your staff?
Um, so I will be very transparent about like my personal approach
Yeah.
and like what we ultimately did as a school. So as a school, we did lead a community meeting. Like we had a conversation that was opt in. There was also a facing history um, session that happened that we suggested everyone attend, and then the follow-up conversation post attending that session. Our leadership team also compiled like a number of different resources that was shared with teachers, and teachers were like, reaching out to individuals on their own to get, guidance and best practices around how to lead the conversation. Personally, my feelings was just that I don't feel anyone should be forced into having these conversations. And this is coming, just to give a little context, I was a classroom teacher when the riots happened, and I say riots with quotation marks, in Baltimore as a result of Freddie Gray's death. And so, and my school was literally 2 blocks away from like that CVS that they were broadcasting across CNN at the time. So, and we were in school, like it wasn't COVID happening at that time.
Yeah.
So from that experience, like I had already seen this happen. So when this all started, that was my initial response. Like, I've been here, I've seen this before. And I think that when we try to pressure teachers into having these conversations when they are not prepared, don't have the language, are not comfortable, it can do more harm than good. And so I just communicated to the teachers that I spoke to, like, if you feel ready and if you're, in a place to have the conversation, go for it. But if you are not, I'm not pushing that because I don't want you, in hindsight, to do more damage. I also emphasize the importance of making sure you communicate with parents prior to having the conversation in your classroom. The reason being, like, you want to first get an understanding of how much kids already know, right? Like, what have they been exposed to already? What are the conversations that they're having at home? The second part of that is there may be some parents who don't want you to lead that conversation with their kids, and we want to give them the space to opt out. So that was my first thing that I said, like, reach out to parents, see what parents have said to their kids, if they said anything at all. Share the text, videos, whatever you plan to discuss in the classroom with parents first. Yeah. Invite parents to be a part of the conversation, since we are virtual now and they have the access and ability to do so. So that was kind of my approach. I chose not to go deep into my personal feelings, just because, being very transparent, I wasn't in a space to help other people unpack their feelings about all of this.
Yeah.
I just wasn't there. And that was something that I just had to be honest and like open about.
Yeah. Curious, Rob, like with you, like as you work to support new teachers, like Black male teachers, right? How have you supported some of the individuals a part of your organization in kind of understanding what's going on, but also like in them potentially leading conversations or being a part of conversations in their school building?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that, more generally speaking, the teacher's role right now is to do some work on themselves, and instead of looking for a list of best practices, because in that way you're just looking for a toolkit to just pull out when something looks like it matches, then you'll do that thing, and it doesn't mean it's going to work this time. It doesn't mean that you actually have a change of thought or any kind of empathy or understanding, cultural understanding. So in that same vein, what we do with our mentors is make sure they have an understanding of self. So our entire curriculum, when they are working with students, is social emotional learning, identity development, and vocabulary acquisition, so they could communicate everything that they learned about their own emotions and where they are socially emotionally. So not only do our mentors practice that within themselves, that's the curriculum that they are teaching, and they're really starting to pick up on and use some of the same language and some of the skills that we talk about in our sessions together and when they're with their students. We really hope and believe that they will be able to take that language to have conversations with other people. We try to keep it an open space where is very safe and they can express those things, and we get the same things from the students. So hopefully, because of those conversations and the way that they're feeling like they are going, we have parents jump on a call sometimes. So is the fact that they can see it working, that they can see these conversations growing into to more, that they could start to come up with ideas. Hopefully, they can take that with them. And then, as we continue to grow, I didn't mention earlier that we are in our pilot phase of our program,
Gotcha.
but as we continue to grow, that is a part of our longer term curriculum, is how to advocate in your workspace, given your identity and everything else I just talked about.
Gotcha. No, that's really really great, and kind of on the same thing. But as an entrepreneur, somebody who one is super blessed to be working for yourself, like me and Tamisha, was like wow, like that's amazing. I think for me, like in leading my organization, and curious to hear from you, like how did it impact you? Just like in your when you think about just your purpose and like passion, and did you have to like take some time, like like I'm not ready to work. I tried to push through, and I felt
Hmm.
like I hit a dead wall and was just very unproductive. I needed to process. I needed time to think, read, reflect, and I
Hmm.
tried for the sake of deadlines to just keep working, and it
Hmm.
didn't do me any justice. So curious, like how did that impact you, and then even Tamisha, just hear from you as well.
It didn't really, I didn't feel like I needed to stop everything and have a big reflective moment.
Okay.
But I was for probably a good 2 weeks kind of lost. I
Mhm.
didn't know really how to respond. I kept my day to day, and that felt fine. It didn't feel forced, but at some points I was wondering what should I do.
Yeah.
I didn't really feel energized to uh, participate in protests, and that's only, I think we need that to happen. The
Definitely.
only reason, literally the only reason that I didn't feel energized for it is because it felt like deja vu from 5 to 6 years ago, marching for Black Lives Matter in a very similar situation. So I'm wondering about what can we actually do to make sure to go past the moment,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually I recognize that it's in my work that that's happening. So what I've been able to really highlight more with the people that participate in our program is that this is a form of protest. We're helping Black males, first of all, be more present and and give a different face to what it means to be a Black man. And even within that, it's important that we make sure that they all know that those are unique identities. It's not a monolithic Black man that we're talking about. We're talking about you, Derrick, who is a Black man,
Right.
or me, Robert, who is a Black man, and how we might show up in different spaces, particularly schools and with our kids. And the goal is for not only that helps the mentor, the college student, but that can rub off on the boys, so they can grow up seeing Black men having different reactions to this situation, and having different personality traits and different things that they like or dislike, so they know that it's okay for you to be whoever you are. And then to couple that with the direct social emotional learning that we do, we make it clear that there are a lot of different ways to feel and there's a lot of ways to react. We focus on making sure you're intentional about those reactions. We don't really say you shouldn't be doing this or that, but if you do that, is this really the emotion that you're trying to communicate? Is
Yeah.
this really the way you want it to come off?
Yeah.
And as long as those things are yeses, then we are supportive to make sure the students understand language and actions that can carry that out.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think I was a part of the Surge Fellowship, and I talk about this all the time. But the founder, Carmita, talks about the different roles of protesting, right? Like everyone, you have people who are meant to be on the front lines, the agitators,
Hmm.
right? Like the out protesting, getting the word out. But protesting would not work if you didn't also have the infiltrators, the
Right.
individuals who are working in the system, who bring their culture, that bring these ideas, equity, that bring all these things to and infiltrate the system, right?
Right.
And then you have the orchestrators, the people at the top, like who have the money, and they are the ones that are in the boardrooms making the decisions. And if each one of these people aren't in the right place, nothing will get done, right? I think the
Mm-hmm.
problem is when we as a people begin to demonize these different roles,
Right.
right? And we begin to look down on certain people because you weren't here, you didn't do that, like why I ain't see you, right? And it's like, well, actually, as you were saying, Rob, like my work, if I'm not here building these programs, building this safe space that affirms students, that gives them this space to develop and grow as leaders, to understand what's going on, right? Then, like, what is the domino effect of that? So it's like we all play a very important role. So I appreciate you bringing that up because that was exactly how I felt as well. So yeah. In curious though, in kind of flipping a little bit, both of you all do very like interesting work around girls, black boys, right? So I'm curious, like, what is your why? We hear it all the time, right? Like, what is your why? But what is that story? What is that thing that propelled you to want to hone in specifically on this specific group? So yeah, and we can start with Tamesha. For you specifically, girls' education. What birthed that kind of passion for you?
Um, so it actually has two parts to it. The first part of it is I always knew that I was going to a black college from like the as young as I can remember. Like in my middle school yearbook, my assistant principal at the time wrote like send me a invitation to your graduation from Clark Atlanta. Like I knew I was going to an HBCU.
Yeah,
And my mom was so like um, stuck on this idea that I was going to Spelman. And shout out to Spelman. This is nothing against Spelman,
right.
but I remember going to visit the school and realizing that while this is a school for Black women, it doesn't feel like a space for every Black woman.
Yeah,
My major in undergrad was fashion merchandising. I was really into the arts, and that wasn't a major at that school. And I just remember thinking, like, I want to go to a space that's for Black women and, like, truly all Black women can feel invited and welcome in this space. Like, there's a space for me. It was a certain type of Black woman that was welcome. And again, this is no shade to Spelman. Shout out to the AUC. But that was, that was like a part of my thinking.
yeah,
Like I wanted to create a space where Black girls were at the forefront, at the center, and every Black girl felt welcome in that space.
yeah,
So that was one part of it. The second part of it was when I graduated from middle school and was going to high school. There was a young lady in my class. I think she was a year or 2 years older than me, and she was going to a boarding school in New York. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with boarding schools, but typically boarding schools are predominantly white. And I remember my mom being like, I'm not sending you somewhere great means you won't see people that look like
yeah,
you. And so I wasn't able to go to this boarding school. And I was just like, once again, like, here's this idea of like, here's a space for all girls, and not all girls are welcomed in this space. And so I just kept going back to like, I want to create a space for girls centered around Black girls where they would feel welcome. I also feel like a lot of the times our passion or our commitments come from places of deficit, but there's also a component of the story where it comes from a place of surplus. So where I actually went to schools growing up was I like to say, minority white community. It was a town in Long Island that was majority Black leadership. Our superintendent was a Black woman. Shout out to Dr. Clark. Most of our teachers and staff was Black people, which is not common. You also often hear this narrative that like, I didn't have my first Black teacher or professor until college, or there's only like 2% Black male teachers in the US. And that was not my experience. I've always had Black teachers from like pre-K on to college because I went to an HBCU. And this was not a low performing school district. We were blue ribbon schools. We had traveling clubs. We had tons of things that now people associate with affluent schools. And it wasn't a community that was, I would say it was a community that ranged socioeconomically. Like I had students that I went to school with that parents were very accomplished. And then I also had classmates who, you know, we knew lived in shelter. So it ranged socioeconomically, but it was high performing and we had access to a lot of opportunities. And I just didn't realize that that wasn't a norm until I left that space and then started to hear this narrative that, you know, underserved communities are typically Black and brown communities and they're low performing and they don't have opportunities. And I'm like, hold up, that was not my experience. And that's not the narrative that I'm going to lead with or continue to share, because that might not be everyone's experience, but the opposite is not everyone's experience as well. And so from that, I felt this drive to want to make sure that I create spaces that look like that, right? Like this is a school that is serving predominantly Black and brown girls, and it is high performing and they have access to tons of things. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the school is going to be in affluent community or a low income community, but it means that they're going to have opportunities. And so I just feel like I would love to be around more Black women, more Black people in general that have that same experience, right? Like went to schools that were great. And not so much of like the narrative that we often hear. So it was like a little bit of different things that led me to this, but I think ultimately it's just wanting to find a space for Black girls to be the center, right? Like we often hear about the ways that Black boys are marginalized in schools, and even like what's happening right now in the world, right? Like the focus so much is on the Black men that are being like shot and killed, and yet Breonna Taylor's killers are still out there, and we're not hearing that story told enough. And so I think sometimes as Black women, and I often say like as a Black woman, I'm always a Black girl because I was a Black girl first. We sometimes get lost in the narratives, and I just want to make sure that that doesn't continue to happen.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's crazy this weekend, and I don't remember where I saw it, and I hate I'm not going to know the name, but this woman did a TED Talk, and at the beginning of her TED Talk, she named off all of, and of course this wasn't to, you know, diminish anybody's story, but she named all of the Black boys and men who had been killed by police, right? So, you know, Freddie Gray, Trayvon Martin, all these names. And then she went and she asked people to sit down when they recognized them.
Yes.
And then she went down this second list who were all Black women. And everyone was standing. Like I didn't even know that this was a thing, right? Like I had never heard this story. I never heard this name outside of, you know, Sandra Bland and you know that was the only name that people really recognized. So it really does go to your point, and not to, you know, always bring it to that, you know, a tragic situation, but even the experiences, the stories of Black women, oftentimes, as you said, are overlooked. And when you think about the level of impact and the level of support and the things that Black women do just to keep life in our country going, it's like, why is this? So, you know, I totally appreciate and resonate with what you said. Rob, what about you? Like, what was it that kind of drove your like passion to support Black boys and men, specifically in education?
That came from my. It's really hard to pick out a situation. It came from a chain of things throughout my life, and especially as it pertained to the education setting. So I started off schools in Detroit. I was born in Detroit, and it was all Black school for the most part. I moved to Cincinnati in the second grade. Again, went to a school with mostly black students and a lot of black staff. And then I went to a predominantly white school, and suddenly I'm getting phone calls home. Suddenly I'm in trouble a lot more. At the time, I didn't really think too much of it. I just knew I didn't like my school. I didn't really know why. It was definitely a different feel. I had a teacher in the fourth and fifth grade who used to always just say like, "What are we going to do with you?" That's she used to say that to me all the time. They didn't really know why am I standing up? What's this conversation I'm having? But my grades never really suffered throughout school, and that was where her confusion was coming in. Like, what are we gonna do? Like, you do your work, but now all this other stuff is happening. Um, Fast forward when I went to middle school, I had left like the district and came into this district into when I was in middle school, and I had a teacher who refused to move me up in a math level, and they did tracking at this school because he just didn't think I could do the work for whatever reason. So then I was tracked throughout high school at a lower like math track, and I found myself like helping people on taking harder classes than I was and things like that. And he pushed it out like maybe next week until a point where it became it's just too late. And again, at the time, I didn't really think much of it. When I went to college, and as I said, I majored in education. On my way out, my advisor tried to advise me away from becoming a teacher. She was like coming up with these other things maybe I should do or maybe I should think about, which was interesting to me because I had gotten mostly positive feedback from like my placements and student teaching and things like that. But that was still the conversation that we had before I left. Obviously, I still went into education, and I see it in my staff, well, in my former staff, that would just not understand kids again. Like, I can see myself as a boy in the school, and the teacher having that same kind of reaction, whether they use those words or not, but the what are we going to do with you thing, where then now you see a student that I could see is way under challenged and therefore talking a lot in class, and you see a defiant student.
Yeah.
So then when it's come time for me to recommend him for AP classes, we have a much different view of
Yeah.
who this child is.
Yeah.
So all of those things together with so many more experiences help me realize that people who experience the same thing as our students in some kind of way, there's a bunch of different intersectionalities of who a person is. And the more different types of people we have in a school setting, the more that we have people who can understand kids and actually do what's best for them and keep them in mind. And then as a student, I think about what I have been perceived or even acted differently in different situations had I been around different adults. When I was kicking off He Is Me, I did some empathy interviews with a bunch of people. And one student, it was a black male who had just recently graduated high school at the time, he said to me, getting advice from a black male feels different than a white woman teacher, even if they say the same thing. And I was like, why is that? He's just like, for one person it feels like they're giving me advice because they've been through it. The other one, it feels like they're telling me what to do and that they know better than me. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, wow, this for students to be able to articulate that and know, and it's not because they don't like a person.
Right.
It's just that if they don't understand where you're coming from, they question your credibility. Like, how do you know how to tell me how to navigate my neighborhood to get to school on time in a place like this if you didn't live it?
Yep.
How do you tell me how to navigate when I ran into the police yesterday on my way home from school and you're still telling me I should have had all my homework done?
Right.
So having those people, it's important to have people who are different from students, as well as having people who are similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. When I started teaching, I was working at Urban Prep here in Chicago. Not when I first started teaching, but when I moved to Chicago, I was teaching at Urban Prep here in Chicago. And I saw my job very differently than I think a lot of other teachers did. I saw my job as what you were saying, right? Like being a big brother, being somebody who can help you navigate, showing you. I was a history teacher, and showing you the truth in what we're learning, right? So that you can go out into this world and lead and be different. So yeah, I totally get that, and that's actually like the direction that I want to kind of go in now is the role of like diversity in schools. When I think about the reason I got into education is very similar to you, Rob, but it wasn't something that I experienced, but something that I saw in my younger brother. We had very different school experiences, but when I think about the school to prison pipeline. Um, like my brother experienced all those things, and I wanted to be in a school to be able to see that a student is not just up talking and being defiant. Like
Right.
he's bored. Like he needs to be challenged a little bit more. Like go over there and embrace this student as opposed to like what you're doing is wrong. Like get out, writing the student up. Like what does that say to a kid, right? So that that's exactly why I got in to education, but curious like when we think about like the diversity of education, not just racially, right, but male teachers, women teachers, different ages, all of that. What have you all seen? And Tanisha, you leading a school, you shared something a little earlier that was like really shocking to me. But what? How do you all see the role of diversity in schools as it pertains to culture building? Which I believe culture comes first, and then academic success comes next, right? But like, how do you see the role in the diversity of a school leading to those two ends?
Um, so I agree. I always say that culture to me is most important. Like that's primary. If you don't have that together, if you can't get a kid to sit in the seat, you can't teach the kid.
Right.
Like that's where we start.
Right.
And I think the diversity is important, one, for the reasons that we all know. Like everyone brings something different to the table. But when we speak specifically about students having teachers that look like them, that they can identify with, specifically in terms of race, because you can identify with someone in a number of ways. We know that, right? But specifically in terms of race, I think regardless of how you grew up, because I don't want people to walk away thinking that we're saying all Black people are the same, so we can just relate that way.
Right.
But there is a shared racial experience that universally like brings us together, and I think that it contributes to the school culture because like that's our like we're sharing a culture. I recently attended the graduation of some students that I taught in 5th grade. They just graduated from 8th grade, right? And they invited us to attend. And once again, because we're virtual, everyone was able to be there and share that moment.
Right.
But afterwards, I remember texting some of my staff who I was on the team with at that time and saying, this was hands down the best staff I ever worked on in a school team. And it was a charter school in Brooklyn. And I think what made that school team so great to work on is because it was a younger school team, not to be ageist, but it was a younger school team, and it was primarily Black teachers. Like it was primarily Black staff, and we were serving all Black school. It was in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights. And like a lot of the concerns that we had in terms of culture, I should say a lot of the issues that I've experienced culture-wise in schools didn't exist at this school because we could relate, like not just when it came to students, but when it came to parents. And when issues did arise, what I did appreciate was people didn't turn, our white coworkers didn't turn to like, oh, what does research say? They actually respected our lived experiences and like took like our advice and like implemented what we suggested. And I think that that played a huge role in like why our school was such an amazing school. Like year after year when they, charters love data, right? So year after year when they would do like the culture surveys, our school kept ranking number one. And I think a huge part of it was like, one, the staff was diverse, like it was a lot of Black staff, and two, um, like our lived experience was respected
Yeah.
as like valuable and as knowledge. Like it wasn't like a what let's crack open this book and see, what this white author wrote about how Black kids learn. It was like, let me tap into my coworkers and see what they think. And when something happened that we were like, this is like a breach of the culture, people didn't, weren't offended by our suggestions. Like they took it and implemented it. So I definitely think it played a role. And like there was his I remember there was a student who pretty much she was maybe 12 at the time, and pretty much was like leading her household. Like she was responsible for like taking care of her younger siblings, getting them to school every day. Like she was the adult in her household.
Yeah.
So when she came to school, it was not easy for her to make that transition from being the authority at home to now having to listen to other people telling her what to do. And it's not always easy for people to like unpack that context and like, put it into context. Like
Yeah.
this is the transition that a 12-year-old is making. So she's not necessarily being disrespectful or defiant. You just have to understand that she's usually the one making and setting the rules, and now she has you not like any level. And so like those situations like that is why the diversity is needed. Like we need people who can understand our kids, and don't have to be taught how to understand our kids. It's just innate, like we get it.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, like the reframing of our students' experiences, right? Where oftentimes it would be seen as problematic or issues, but when you have experienced that, you know exactly what's going on. You're able to be like, hold on, wait a minute, like let me go talk to old girl because this is not an
Right.
actual issue. But interesting. So one thing I love about Black people, I mean, we go through it,
Right?
but we know how to find joy in the mist. So there was this tweet thread in reference to Amy Cooper. And it says, let's talk about the Amy Cooper teacher in schools, right? And I think we kind of are like talking a lot about the importance of culture, the importance of knowing our students, the importance of understanding your privilege, placing that stuff aside, and realizing that we're in this to help our students. So I'm gonna read a couple of these tweets, and I'm interested to hear some of your responses to this. All right, so the first one: calls for security because student won't sit in the assigned seat. I think, Robert, you were just talking a little bit about that, right? Like not sitting in an assigned seat. Like, is that really an issue? I mean, like, come on. Like,
Right.
the next one always wants to know what's the discipline policy. Always wants to know what's the discipline policy, color coded preferred, and must have escalations. So we're at the PD, start of the year.
Yep.
Welcome, we're excited, and you're like, look, do we have a defined discipline policy this year?
Yep.
And what's the escalations of when I need to send a student out? How do we know a student that doesn't need to go on a field trip?
Right.
All these things. The referral policy says that they feel threatened regardless of the size of the child. 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 8-year-old, threatened by a child. Shaking my head. Calls the main office for security again, or a counselor, or or anyone, right? Anybody, somebody, come in this room and talk to this kid.
Mhm.
Then calls the office again to share how long they've been waiting. Why has nobody come? I've been sitting here for 10 hours. Such and such is still causing an issue. Um,
That to me is like, you might as well have been Amy Cooper and said, there's this black kid in my class who I need you to come pick up. Like, it's
Right.
literally no different from what Amy Cooper did in the park. Like,
Right.
I don't think people make that comparison enough, that like the dean, the assistant principal, the principal, you calling them for like these very low level behaviors is
Mhm.
sometimes very like symbolic, like what we see when the police are called on black people for things that are just ridiculous.
right.
And it's not to invalidate, you know, what could be happening in your classroom in that moment, but it's just to push you to think about how you can better respond to not continue like these behaviors, right? Like that's what it means to be like dismantling racism. I think that's why like I was so hesitant to want to jump in and like unpack people's feelings about what's happening in the world, because it's like, before we talk about racism in the world, let's talk about racism in our own school
In
building,
our
right?
Right.
school, in the school.
Let's
Right.
talk about what it looks like here.
And then,
Jesus.
Tamisha, like a continuation from the connection you just made is when we have these discipline policies that are if-then statements throughout the whole book, then it's basically a form of like minimum sentencing, and then teachers and administrators can throw their hands up because if you did this, then this is just your consequence. Like it just is what it is, and oftentimes the most like severe consequence a school will give is like an expulsion or suspension, and we use those too much still to this day with especially certain demographics of kids, and that's not very different from now the cop came in,
Hmm. Hmm.
still didn't do the things that I'm asking for you to do, or I still feel threatened, and then they have a different most powerful weapon that they could use, but it's not a different mindset.
Yep.
A person calls because I feel this low level thing is big. The authority figure comes in. I feel like I can't control the situation. I'm gonna lay down the biggest way I can come down on this person as possible.
Yep. No, that's so real. I think at my school, one of the things that I've said to teachers is if suspensions were off the table, you cannot suspend or expel anybody. Can you imagine the level of creativity of teachers to be able to restore trust, continue in relationship, to hold students accountable because that is needed at times, right?
Absolutely.
But why are we suspending kids? Like what? I really don't understand. And I will say that that is a level of growth for me, right? And when I talk to other teachers about it, I oftentimes share, you know, yes, your first thought is as a teacher, how do I remain control? How do I remain in control of this situation? And whatever I have to do, I'm gonna do it. But as a teacher, when you grow and you learn and you understand that that is a tenet of white supremacy and that you are only enacting the it's like, you know, you finally have the power and now you're coming down hard, right? Like, that's not my role as a teacher. And it takes a level of growth. So when you share that, I think with teachers, like, we're not suspending this kid. Another thing that I get like from teachers too is like when we think about like, oh boy not sitting in his seat, and so I'm calling security. Same thing of like, you know, a kid's head is down in class. When ooh, if I could count the number of students getting sent out of class. Well, teacher, what are you doing that's so boring? Like, what are you doing in your classroom that this kid feels that they want to put their head down or they're on their phone? Maybe you should take a look at what you're doing to make this so boring for that child. Like, and I feel like you get so much pushback, but it's the truth. Like,
Right.
It
you,
makes me like, when you think about going back to consequences, right? When I was a teacher, I barely ever sent the kid out. If I sent a kid out of the classroom, that kid and the administrator knew it was real because I just didn't do it very often. And the reason why is because I was able to be very creative with my consequences in the classroom. And the reason why I was able to be creative is because I knew my kids, right?
Right.
So you can't get creative with punishments if you don't really know. It's just like with a parent. A parent knows how to punish you, right?
Yeah.
They know it's going to hurt because they know the child. And
Right.
so I'm like, it's the same way with teachers. If you know your student, you know how to get this kid to learn the lesson that you want them to learn from whatever, event occurred, and redirect them to the appropriate behavior without sending them out of the classroom.
Mhm.
Like, you can creatively do that if you have a relationship with that kid and know them well enough. But if you don't have anything to leverage, and that's why you're sending them out.
Yep.
Right. And then when you do send them out or call folks in, it chips away at your authority.
Yep.
Like, if you
Yeah.
can't do it, I'm going to call the dean. It's like, okay, well, what are you for? So that means I don't have to do anything until, and then there's become a times when as soon as a dean or a school administrator show up, the kid gets right up and leaves and do whatever they're supposed to do. They're just not doing it for you because you've told them over and over that I'm not authority, somebody else is.
Yep. Yep. That is
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
true. Last two things, and then we're gonna move to kind of like last points, right? So the other thing, because at my school this year we implemented restorative justice, and Amy Cooper talks about how restorative justice will never work and misses the good old days, right? Like when we could suspend kids, send them to the discipline office. When I think about moving to now this reimagining of schools post COVID, when I think about a reimagined school, I think of a school, Tanisha and Rob, that their suspension is not, it's off the table. We are not suspending a kid because we care about your child that much, right? There are some exceptions, right? And I think we can discuss what those exceptions are. But we care about them so much that we want them to we're going to keep them here, right? We will be creative. We'll figure out what we need to do to hold that kid accountable. But our culture is going to be so great. We are going to center student voice so much. We are going to be culturally relevant and responsive to the things that we see in our building that our students like are going to love to be in our class. They are going to love, as you're saying, Tamisha, we should be leveraging students being away right now. They want to come back. What are we going to do different that's going to keep
Right.
them, right? So I would love to hear, those are my things, what I imagine a school. No suspensions, culture at an all-time high, teachers understanding their privilege, and being able to build relationships and be culturally responsive to those in their classrooms. How do you all envision reimagining what school looks like post-COVID?
I think the way you just described the school is ideal. Like, we definitely want to get there. And if you're operating a classroom or a school that has those elements to it that you just described, and you have a student who's angry or doing whatever behavior that you're not looking for, that should be concerning to you. It shouldn't be criminal to you. That's confusing.
Yeah.
This is a good place. People like to be here, and you're upset. Something's not right. If you are an effective teacher, say you teach a math class and you tell a kid to do a math problem and they blow up on you, that's not really logical. That's a place of concern. So if we start to shift how we interpret behaviors from students and shift the fact that they have perceptions and perspective on what's going on in their community and involve those perspectives and ideas, and these what you described can happen. What I see a lot of times is that the school staff would know the rules and know the rationale behind expectations, and the kids might feel it differently. And ultimately, their experience is what matters.
Yeah.
You can't say like, well, everybody here got it wrong. That's not the rules. Like, well, for some reason, that's the vibe. So we need to really listen to students and have them be a part of coming back. And as you said, they want to be back. A lot of times students like to be in school more than they say anyway. At the end of the summer, they all want to go back and, all that
Right.
stuff. So we could really
Big plan.
leverage this at this time to figure out, okay, what does that mean? And how can we still incorporate what we know works in academics, but Also keeping in mind that schools were designed one day and we kept them the same. There's nothing inherently saying that schools need to be 6 or 7 hours and kids need to go to 5 different classes. Like there's that's made up. So we could really leverage some of this stuff we're learning, as you mentioned earlier, from virtual learning.
Yep.
And remote virtual learning does not mean necessarily you have to be in a different building.
Right.
I mean, people think that when we say that you can be all in the same classroom doing virtual learning. There's just so many different levers we could pull now, as we have to reimagine schools anyway. So does not try to reimagine them in 2.0 version of what already existed, especially because it didn't really work that well.
Yep, I agree. In grad school, one of my professors stated, if somebody grew up 100 years ago, let's just say 100 years, right? They come back into 2020. The one place that they would feel most secure and like the most like I know what's going on is a school building, right?
Right.
Nothing radical has changed about schools since it started, right? Like, so I feel like what you were saying, Rob, like this is an opportunity like that we need to leverage to really rethink and be radical about like what we want for our students, like for our communities, what they need. Really quick, and I'll come to you, Tamisha. When I first started TFA, I interviewed at this school in New Orleans. It was all computers. And I was like, what? Like, I do not want to do, like, this is not what I envision school to be. Like, students on computers, like, going through things at their own pace. I'm like, well, how do we know, like, all these questions? Here we are, almost 9 years later, and look at us, like on computers. I'm just like, that school was so ahead of the curve. Like, I wish I could go and find that school and like figure out what they're doing now. But yeah, I love that. Tamisha, what about you? Like, what do you imagine like for schools post COVID?
I can easily echo like what the both of you have shared. I had this professor in grad school, Dr. Nathan, and she taught a class called Building Democratic Schools. And it was a group of us who wanted to open up schools, and we all thought our designs were just so unique and so different. And she pretty much said to us like, nothing anybody is doing is like new or innovative, right? Like just crushed us nicely. But it put me to think about like, how do we really create schools like now today that are like so drastically different or better, right? And I think like this is the moment. Like what we're seeing right now is forcing us to like reimagine what schools look like. Something I am appreciative of is like the staff that I work with now is so creative. Like I am always just like sharing how so many of the things that they have done even during this time to continue to make learning fun and engaging. I definitely can see them like continuing that no matter what school looks like in the fall. So like we're already thinking about like whether we go back into the school building or not, like how do we still incorporate this element of Zoom classes? Like can we install, and will be speaking from a place of privilege for a moment because I am at a charter school. So like, there's conversations around, do we install webcams in every classroom? So like kids who can access the lab, and even if they're home, when school's open, there still might be some families who are like, I'm not comfortable sending my kid back. So how do we make sure that those kids can still engage? So I really think like, even for the schools that are the most like innovative in terms of like technology, which I would have considered my school prior to this, like the transition wasn't as hard for us because we are a one-to-one school. Every kid already had a Chromebook. Most of our platforms are online platforms. So it was just a matter of making sure kids knew like their logins and passwords, but the transition wasn't that hard. But it's, I think, pushing us even more to be like, are we really doing all that we can do with technology? And so I'm interested to see like how that plays out. But I have like no doubt that like our teaching team will be on top of it because like they're willing and they're usually finding resources and sharing them that like sometimes we didn't even know about.
Right.
And so, yeah, I am interested to see that. And I will say, like, just also going back to like the diversity part, our staff is young. And so I think that plays a part in it too. Like our school honestly would not be a good fit for someone who was not good with technology, because our school is like totally technology based. So I think for me, like seeing that element as far as just speaking about instruction, how this will translate in the fall. And I shared earlier, we had tons of students who did extremely well during this time that like had some challenges during the school year earlier on.
Yeah.
And so like, how do we continue to keep them on this trajectory? I also like to think about parents who's often like left out of conversations. Us being virtual now has allowed parents to like be in the back, in the background, seeing what's happening in the classroom. Parents have been really engaged during this time. So how do we keep that momentum when we transition back to schools in the fall?
Yeah, no, I love that. And that goes to that point about like learning happening everywhere. Like it can happen at home, can happen at a barbershop, anywhere, right? Like you can learn, be engaged. And to that point, I had to push back on our team for thinking about. We began to think about like learning loss, like knowledge loss or whatever. And I'm just like, well, how do we know like that students have lost anything? Like they may have gained like a whole bunch more. Granted, there needs to be a plan in place, but I think jumping to that like assumption already, like, well, this hasn't been great. Students aren't learning. Like their parents can't be like whatever type of teachers. Like I think it's kind of like going against kind of what this has been moving forward, right? So making sure that parents have those tools, that they are engaged. We've been thinking about how can we set up something if we have to do virtual in the fall. How do we set up something for parents, right? Like to reestablish like what the norm is, like how you can be engaged, like all those types of things. So thank you for bringing up the parent piece.
And I think like one more point I'd like to add for this transition back is a lot of the conversations around like, instruction, what will learning look like, in like physical space, like how do we maintain like the distance if that's still needed. But I think more like now more than ever, we also have to focus on like the emotional safety and like psychological safety, because there's going to be so much anxiety transitioning back into the school building. And so just like really working through what that will look like if your school didn't focus on SEL before, they don't have no choice but to now.
Yeah.
Because all of this, like we had two pandemics, like COVID and racism overlapping each other, and kids are coming back with a lot of things going on, right? And so that has to be the primary focus above everything else. Like when we talk about safety, it's like the physical space and the psychological safety.
Yeah. Rob, curious as we begin to close out, like how's your organization looking at that? Like the social emotional piece of like students returning back to school, working with like their mentors and even like some of the newer teachers that you're working with. Has there been like an increased focus on being able to lead with that as they transition back?
What we're doing this week, I love that question. What we're doing this week, as I said, is our final week of the program.
Yeah.
We're going to do some practices with the students about transitioning out.
Gotcha.
So like the opposite type of idea.
Yeah.
Hopefully some of that could stay with them as they transition back in. When we do reconvene in the fall, it'll be after school has started, and we can definitely do some back talk about what the transition has been like. Mm-hmm. But in terms of transitioning in, we don't have specific things for that, although part of the things that they've been learning have been like coping tools that they can use more generally, so they can employ some things on their own, and then we'll revisit after school has started.
Cool. Okay, that's what's up. Mm-hmm. Well, if I was a teacher, I would say we did a pretty darn good job because there's no questions. So, I mean, we must have been crystal clear. But thank you guys so much. I think this conversation covered a lot of different things, but I think they were all the things that people have been thinking about, wrestling with, and dealing with during this time. And I am just so inspired and hopeful that people like you are leading this work alongside many other organizations and people of color, Black people in the education space. We did not talk about Boston. I want to talk about Boston because I just don't know like about Boston at all. But maybe we'll have to like do that at a later time. But continue, the amazing stuff that y'all are doing. I appreciate the support and look forward to seeing all the things that y'all have coming up in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you for your work again at Project OneTen. So needed.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for creating this space. This was definitely like just as informative and beneficial for me as I'm sure it was for our listeners. So thank you so much.
Yeah, cool. I'm glad that we were able to do this. And it's interesting, like as we talked about, COVID has like been really great in some ways, right? Like being able to do events like this and talk virtually, as opposed to thinking that we always have to be like together. Although I am really looking forward to having an actual in-person situation very soon. But cool. Thank y'all so much. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and we'll talk soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Y'all have a good one.
All right, Tamesha.